recorded people of African descent to arrive in Puerto Rico was Juan Garrido, who came in 1509 with the Spanish conquistador Juan Ponce de Leon. It was the Spanish who first brought enslaved Africans to the island. Nowadays, March 22nd is celebrated in Puerto Rico as Abolition Day to commemorate the abolition of slavery in 1873. Born in 1874 in Puerto Rico, Arturo Alfonso Schomburg was a historian who dedicated his life to documenting the African diaspora worldwide. The Schomburg Center in New York is named in his honor. Following the Spanish-American War of 1898, the island came under the control of the United States. The Afro-Puerto Rican politician Pedro Albizu Campos participated in the pro-independence movement, for which he spent 26 years in prison. The coastal town of Loíza has a high black population and is synonymous with Afro-Puerto Rican culture, in particular the musical genres plena and bomba. It was the Spanish who first brought enslaved Africans to Trinidad after Christopher Columbus visited the islands in 1498 and claimed it for Spain. Great Britain took control of the islands in 1802 and slavery was abolished in 1834. From 1968 to 1970, the Black Power Revolution gained huge traction in Trinidad, with thousands of young people joining the movement. This led to a number of protests intended to effect social change in Trinidad. The government declared a state of emergency and several Black Power leaders were imprisoned. However, the government did eventually implement a number of the policies that the protesters had lobbied for. African influences in Trinidadian culture are present in food, music, dress, and religion. Calypso music is derived from a West African genre called queso, which enslaved Africans brought to the islands. Famous Trinidadians include Eric Williams, who was the country's first Prime Minister, and Machel Montano, a world-famous soca singer. From the 1500s onwards, Spanish colonialists brought approximately 100,000 enslaved Africans to Venezuela. In 1795, a free black man named José Chiriño led an uprising of black and indigenous people against the Spanish in Coro. Today, there is an airport named in his honor. Since 2005, Afro-Venezuelan Day is celebrated on May 10th to commemorate the date his insurrection began. Afro-Venezuelans played an important role in Venezuela's fight for independence. The most famous Afro-Venezuelan independence fighter was Pedro Camejo, also known as El Negro Primero, or in English, the black man who goes first, because he was reportedly always the first to ride into battle. The population of Curaçao is predominantly of African descent. In 1662, Dutch colonial authorities began bringing enslaved Africans to Curaçao. It was a major slave trading station, with many enslaved Africans being bought and sold in the capital of Willemstad. The Tula Museum, located on a former plantation, recounts the 1795 slave uprising led by Tula Rigaud. It was the biggest uprising of enslaved Africans in the history of Curaçao. Up to 4,000 people revolted, but the rebellion was suppressed. Slavery was abolished in 1863. Today, the most widely spoken language in Curaçao is Papiamento, which is derived from African languages. It was on St. Vincent that the Garifuna community was first formed. There are several theories as to how Africans arrived on the island, including the shipwreck of a slave ship. The Africans mixed with the indigenous Carib people to form a mixed ethnic group known today as the Garifuna. This population resisted French and later British colonial rule for so long that the British thought they would inspire rebellion in other Caribbean colonial territories. The legendary Garifuna chief, Joseph Chatoyer, led his people in several uprisings, though he was killed in battle in 1795. In 1797, the British deported several thousand Garifuna people to the island of Roatan near Honduras. Today, there are significant Garifuna communities in Honduras, Belize, Nicaragua, Guatemala, the USA, and Canada. The British ran sugar plantations on St. Vincent with an enslaved African workforce until slavery was abolished in 1834. St. Vincent achieved independence in 1979. The population of Barbados is primarily of African descent. Enslaved Africans were brought to Barbados by the British in the 17th century, mostly to cultivate sugar and rum. In 1816, a West African man named Bassa led the largest slave uprising in Bajan history. Bassa and his co-conspirators led around 400 people to rebel against British colonial forces. Although Bassa was killed, he remains a symbol of resistance in Barbados. In 1998, Bassa was declared a national hero. One stronghold of African influence in Bajan culture today is the Cropover Festival, an annual festival which dates back to around 1780. The festival is held to celebrate the harvesting of the sugarcane crops. Another African influence is tuk music. At one time, the British colonial authorities banned tuck music as they feared enslaved Africans would use the drums to send each other encoded messages and stage an uprising. St. Lucia was initially inhabited by the indigenous Arawak and Carib peoples. From the 1660s until 1814, the French and British both fought for control and introduced an enslaved African workforce. The island was eventually ceded to the British under the Treaty of Paris. The Brigands' War began in 1794 when a French delegation was sent to St. Lucia to promote the French Revolution among a number of escaped and formerly enslaved Africans. Named the Brigands by the British, they raided plantations for supplies and encouraged other enslaved people to run away. One famous resistance leader was Fleur Gaillard. Well-known St. Lucians include Sir William Arthur Lewis, an economist who was awarded the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences in 1979. Martinique was originally inhabited by Arawak and Carib peoples. Although Christopher Columbus arrived in 1502, it was the French who settled permanently in 1635. They established a lucrative sugar industry for which they used an enslaved African workforce, bringing approximately 216,000 enslaved people to Martinique in total. Slavery was abolished in 1848, and every May 22nd is celebrated as Abolition Day. Lumina Sophie, nicknamed Surprise, was a Martinican resistance leader. In 1870, aged 21, whilst pregnant, she orchestrated a revolt after a black sailor was unfairly imprisoned. Lumina coordinated a group of women to burn down plantations in response. However, the revolt was defeated and Lumina was sentenced to life imprisonment. From the 1930s onwards, the Negritude literary movement, which promoted black pride, gained traction amongst black francophone intellectuals. The earliest inhabitants of Jamaica were the indigenous Redware, Tainos, and Arawak peoples. Enslaved Africans were first brought to Jamaica by the Spanish, who colonized the island in 1494, and subsequently by the British, who colonized Jamaica in 1655. A trade route emerged called the Triangular Trade. At the peak of production, Jamaica produced over 100,000 tons of sugar. The most famous slave resistance leader in Jamaican history is Queen Nanny, the leader of a community called the Windward Maroons, who is celebrated today as a Jamaican national hero. Another national hero is Marcus Garvey, a 20th century political activist who sought to end European colonial rule across Africa and to unite Africans and the African diaspora. To this day, African influences are deeply embedded into Jamaican culture, from foods such as ackee and saltfish, to music such as reggae, to religions such as the Rastafari movement. The vast majority of Bahamians today are descended from West African enslaved people brought to the Bahamas under British colonial rule. This began with the Eleutheran adventurers in the 17th century. The black presence increased in the 1780s after the American Revolutionary War, when British loyalists settled in the Bahamas, bringing with them Gullah people from Georgia and South Carolina. From the 1820s onwards, numerous enslaved African Americans escaped slavery in the US and settled in the Bahamas. Today, there are African influences in Bahamian Creole and Bahamian food, and even in Bahamian music such as gumbe, rake and scrape, and junkanu. One of the most famous Bahamians was the actor, activist, and diplomat Sidney Poitier. He made history at the Oscars in 1964 when he became the first black man to win an Academy Award for Best Actor. He directed numerous films, including the 1980 comedy Stir Crazy, starring Richard Pryor and Gene Wilder. St. Kitts and Nevis is the smallest sovereign federation in the world. The population is predominantly of African descent. Africans were brought to the islands under British colonial rule from the 17th century onwards as part of the transatlantic slave trade. They mainly worked on sugar plantations and in agriculture. Today, African heritage is reflected in music such as calypso and steel pans, and traditional foods such as dumplings, pilau, and conkeys. From December to January, Carnival is celebrated in St. Kitts, which naturally includes a multitude of African influences, such as the Moko Jumbis, who are stilt walkers wearing brightly coloured costumes. Known as the Father of Independence, Robert Llewellyn Bradshaw was the first Premier of St. Kitts and Nevis from 1967 until his death in 1978. He was instrumental in negotiating the country's independence from the United Kingdom and was posthumously made the first national hero of St. Kitts and Nevis. The population of Antigua and Barbuda is predominantly descended from enslaved West Africans brought to Antigua from the 17th century onwards to cultivate sugar, indigo, ginger, and tobacco. In addition to English, Antiguan Creole was also spoken, derived from West African languages. The national dish of Antigua and Barbuda is fungi, which bears some resemblance to West African cuisine such as fufu. The Antiguan flag was designed in 1966 by Sir Reginald Samuel. The black stripe represents the African ancestry of the people. One person of exceptional note is Dame Nellie Robinson. She pioneered the country's education system and founded her own school, the Thomas Oliver Robinson Memorial School, where students of any ethnicity, social class, and faith were admitted. She was made a member of the Order of the British Empire in 1941 and, in 2006, became the country's only female national hero. The early inhabitants of Guadeloupe were the indigenous Arawak people. In 1493, Christopher Columbus named the island Santa Maria de Guadalupe. The French settled and brought the first enslaved Africans in 1650 to work on sugar plantations. The British invaded Guadeloupe in 1794, prompting the French to reclaim the island and abolish slavery. When they reinstated slavery in 1802, the resistance leader, Louis Delcres, led an uprising. A bust of Delcres was erected 200 years later in 2002. In 1936, Félix Éboué became the first black governor of Guadeloupe. In 1946, Guadeloupe went from being a colony to an overseas department of France. In 2015, Memorial Act was inaugurated, a museum dedicated to the history of the slave trade as part of UNESCO's Slave Route project. African influences in contemporary Guadeloupe include the dialect of French Creole, the musical genres zouk and compas, food items such as yam and okra, and the annual carnival. Haiti was the first nation in Latin America and the Caribbean to achieve independence, the first country to abolish slavery, and the only nation in history successfully established by a slave revolt. Under French colonial rule, hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans were trafficked to Haiti, in particular to work on sugar plantations. The French Revolution, which began in 1789, was a huge turning point for Haiti. It ultimately influenced the 1791 Haitian Revolution, in which thousands of enslaved Africans, free blacks, and mixed-race people rose up to overthrow European colonial rule. The revolution was led by Toussaint Louverture, an esteemed military general who died before the revolution ended. He was superseded by his deputy, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who became the first leader of the sovereign state of Haiti in 1804. Today, the population of Haiti is overwhelmingly of African descent, and African heritage can be found throughout Haitian cultural identity. The Dominican Republic and Haiti share an island called Hispaniola, located in the Caribbean Sea. It was in the Dominican Republic that Christopher Columbus founded the first Spanish colony in the New World in 1493. The Spanish began trafficking enslaved Africans to Hispaniola in the early 1500s. One notable slave resistance leader of the period was Sebastián Lemba, who, in 1532, led an uprising against Spanish colonial rule. Mama Tingo was a Dominican farmer and activist leader who fought to defend the rural farming community in the Dominican Republic from illegal land seizures. She was assassinated in 1974, and today in the Dominican Republic there is a statue and a subway station in her honor. The Congos of Villa Maya are a collection of communities based in Villa Maya, descended from the Congo region in Africa. In 2001, the community was declared an expression of intangible cultural heritage by UNESCO. Third biggest African diaspora population in the world after Brazil and the United States. The department with the largest black population is Chocó, of which the capital is Quito. Two Afro-Colombian groups have their own language and culture. Those are the Palenqueros in San Basilio de Palenque and the Raizales in San Andrés and Providencia. The Spanish first began trafficking enslaved Africans to Colombia in the 16th century to work on the sugar plantations and in the gold and emerald mines. Enslaved Africans communicated with each other via drums over long distances. Enslaved African women used cane rows to braid escape routes into their hair. They also hid nuggets of gold and emeralds and smuggled seeds inside their braids, which they used to plant crops when they escaped and formed free settlements. Slavery was abolished in Colombia on the 21st of May, 1851. Since 2001, this date has been annually celebrated as Afro-Colombian Day. From 1789 to 1820, an estimated 800,000 enslaved Africans were trafficked to Cuba. This was fundamental to the production of sugar and tobacco. By 1839, Cuba was the largest producer of sugar in the world and the largest market for enslaved Africans in the Caribbean. One famous slave resistance leader was Colota Lucumí, who co-led an uprising at the Triunvirato plantation in Matanzas. Afro-Cubans played a pivotal role in the Cuban War of Independence in 1895. The second in command of the Cuban Independence Army was the mixed-race military commander Antonio Maceo, renowned for his bravery and military acumen. Regla de Ocha is an Afro-Cuban religion which was introduced to Cuba by the Yoruba people of present-day Nigeria. Havana is home to the Yoruba Cultural Association of Cuba, a museum and religious center. The Casa de Africa is a museum in Old Havana which houses over 2,000 objects related to the African diaspora in Cuba.